For years, people have claimed that the GATE program was about more than intelligence, that it was some sort of experiment. Well, I finally have something that proves they weren't imagining it. Hidden in old parapsychology records and government research, there's direct evidence that ESP testing really was conducted in public elementary schools. And tonight, I'm going to show you the proof. Hi, and welcome back to Wicked Mysterious. I'm your host, Danny. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping. I did get this information from a fellow researcher and YouTuber named Cryptid Candy. We were connected through a mutual subscriber, Kay. And I'm lucky enough to have Cryptid Candy featured in this episode, and I'll be in his, which is also dropping soon, so you'll have two videos to watch. I want to give a deep, heartfelt thank you to Kay for connecting us, and I want to thank Cryptid Candy for his collaboration and sharing his documents with me so that I can share them with you, as well as his support, encouragement, and knowledge that he has so graciously shared with me. So let's get into it. Before we dive into today's topic, let's take a second to review what we've already learned so I can better explain how we found this information. If you don't want to hear this info again, feel free to skip ahead past the recap using the chapter markers below. But if you've been following the GATE series so far, you already know the story of gifted and talented education and how it's not as straightforward as most of us were told. Over the past 5 or 6, I've lost track, episodes, we've uncovered that the American gifted education system didn't just appear out of thin air. It was born out of Cold War anxiety, psychological experimentation, and a government wide obsession with identifying and monitoring children that might be different in one way or another. In episode 1, we started with the personal stories, the strange anecdotal evidence, and shared memories that so many former GATE students have. Odd tests that didn't make sense, group isolation, hypnosis tapes, pink drinks, and strange teachers. And then we uncovered the legal and historical background that made it all possible, the National Defense Education Act of 1958. It was passed after Sputnik, when the United States suddenly decided that every classroom was the perfect place for psychological programming. The act poured federal money into identifying gifted children, especially in science, math, and languages. But Title V of that law funded guidance counselors and psychologists to test, classify, and report on children's cognitive and emotional data. And this was sometimes without parents consenting, let alone even knowing. And then we traced how that data pipeline evolved. We looked at the influence of Tavistock, Admiral Hyman Rickover, and others who believed education could be used to shape society from the inside. Psychological testing became a tool of social engineering, and early gifted programs functioned as little mini behavioral labs. It wasn't just about who was smart, but it was more about who was compliant, creative, and suggestible. The trail of anecdotal evidence led us to the gateway process and to the CIA's own exploration of consciousness. This included hemisync, altered states, and the idea that human perception could extend beyond the known five senses. We started to see the overlap between government funded psychic research and programs designed to identify exceptional students. And that's when things got really strange. Documents suggested that the same institutions promoting advanced education were also experimenting with how the mind could access non ordinary states, using sound, frequency, and meditation to induce expanded awareness. This had the potential application for psychic espionage. And then I fell down the rabbit hole of MK Ultra and how those techniques didn't just disappear when the program was shut down. That is, if it was actually shut down at all. We explored how language morphed from mind control to behavior modification and from experiments to education. It was during that era, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that programs like GATE, TAG, and GT began spreading across American schools with new terms like cognitive development and enrichment learning. But behind the scenes, the infrastructure for data collection, psychological profiling, and state level tracking had been built. So, what we've learned so far is that gifted and talented education wasn't just about nurturing smart kids. It was a project of national defense policy, psychological experimentation, and social control. It created a segregated education system where select children were studied, measured, and, as some speculate, groomed for purposes we still haven't uncovered. It took education and crossed it with experimentation in schools, leaving behind generations of adults who remember things that shouldn't have happened in a normal classroom. And that brings us to today. So, while we've talked about intelligence testing, behavioral profiling, and even consciousness experiments, there's one aspect of the story that takes it even further. There is now documented evidence, buried in both academic literature and the CIA archives, that psychic ability testing was conducted on children in real public elementary schools. Today, I'm going to show you that exact documentation. But before we do that, I want to introduce Cryptid Candy, who is going to discuss GATE and other gifted and talented programs.
I'm not going to waste your time with a bunch of fluff. I'm here because I found something no one else on YouTube has ever uncovered. Actual proof. Not theories, not rumors, not evidence, but concrete proof that covert experiments were carried out in thousands of American schools. The test subjects weren't a small group. These experiments involved students from preschool all the way through college-level classes. They were testing students for extrasensory perception, or ESP for short. In other words, they were testing students for psychic ability. Extrasensory perception, also known as a sixth sense or cryptesthesia, is a claimed paranormal ability pertaining to the reception of information not gained through the recognized physical senses, but things sensed with the mind. These covert experiments spanned decades, from the 1930s to the early 2000s, and if I'm being honest, nothing suggests they ever really stopped. This wasn't a few curious teachers trying something quirky. This was systematic, massive. Thousands of covert trials involving thousands of students every single year. Records were kept secretly. Student files were accessed quietly, all without parents or the public ever knowing. Most of the experiments were disguised as regular school activities. Word association tests, drawing tasks, science projects like rocket launching exercises, guessing games, meditation sessions, visualization routines. The mild stuff was hidden in plain sight, but the disturbing side was a lot less obvious. Some researchers placed erotic photographs inside sealed envelopes in high school classrooms, just to see if sexual imagery influenced psychic results. There were hints that substances were used in experiments too. Substances like barbiturates, a powerful sedative. And this is only the beginning. Before we go any deeper, you probably have the same questions I had. Who was running these operations? What kind of students were they trying to find? And where is the actual proof? Notice I didn't say evidence. I say proof because what you'll see here today isn't speculation, it's documentation. So let me tell you how I even got here.
We know that the Gifted and Talented Tag, Gate, GT program, whatever you want to call it, that was conducted in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and maybe into the 2000s, we know that they were experimenting on us.
In early 2025, I fell into the Gifted and Talented program rabbit hole. If you watch Wicked Mysterious like I do, then you've heard the stories, but if not, here's a quick recap. Former GATE students have been coming forward with strange memories from their time in their Gifted and Talented program. Some remember playing endless guessing games. Some say they specifically used Zener cards, the classic ESP cards. Others remember drinking a thick, chalky pink liquid. Some were given bulky headphones and told to predict which side a tone would appear from. A few recall listening to the Gateway tapes, and some claim they experienced guided out-of-body sessions with their teacher. And then there are students who remember nothing at all from their time in the program. Many believe these memories were somehow suppressed by the program itself. These are just some of the claims. The common belief tying these testimonies together is simple. GATE wasn't about intelligence, it was about identifying psychic ability. That's what people online were saying anyway. And honestly, I didn't believe a single bit of it. I thought this was just an interesting video topic, and so I started researching. I read decades of GATE documents. I searched ERIC, the Education Resources Information Center. I dove into the Internet Archive. I even read The Gifted Child by Abraham Tannenbaum, once considered the most comprehensive publication on gifted education. By this point, I had about 30 minutes of debunking material, real academic explanations for many of the weird memories surfacing online. Itinerant teachers, traveling teachers. This explained why some gifted and talented instructors weren't part of the regular school faculty. Enrichment models like Renzulli's triad or Bloom's taxonomy model explained unusual activities in the classroom, like tangrams predicting outcomes or reading petroglyphs or hieroglyphics. For the sake of time, I'll stop there, but the point is that it was also explainable, or so I thought, because I would go on to encounter some documents that changed everything. I found a handful of documents that referenced the CIA visiting China to test children for alleged psychic abilities. In the late 1970s, China had a wave of alleged psychic children who had alleged psychic powers, and the CIA was very interested. I saved every document I encountered. The moment I saw these documents, I knew that they had to be investigated further. A question kept coming to mind. If the CIA was so interested in psychic children from China, so much so that they sent a whole research group to travel abroad, why wouldn't they be interested in potentially psychic American children? One of the files I saved was titled Human Paranormal Capabilities, a 94-page CIA document declassified on March 7, 2001. Most of it is the CIA trying to verify psychic children in China. Spoiler, they concluded the children were faking their so-called psychic powers. But then on page 75 of that same document, the tone changes. The header reads, ESP experiments in schools. The document explains that the classroom is an extremely good place for ESP experiments. Then it lists multiple psychic covert classroom experiments, some of which took place in the United States. It details a Florida elementary school. It describes a Holland school disciplinarian invited to the US by Duke University to test for ESP in 5th through 8th grade classrooms, 40 classes in total. It mentions a French elementary school, an unnamed preschool, a multi-year experiment involving 7th graders, and another unnamed junior high. This was a breakthrough, but there was more hiding inside that document. At the top of page 75 is the name L.E. Lyons, an author who doesn't exist, though I'm getting close to finding out who it was, but that's for another time. But underneath that name, it reads, Chapter 3, Advances in Parapsychology Research. That's when all the pieces started connecting. It turns out that Advances in Parapsychological Research is a 10-volume academic series. The first volume was published in 1978, and the most recent came out in 2021. What I found is that 2 full pages of this CIA document was literally copied directly from that series, meaning the CIA document was only the tip of something much larger. The series was edited by Stanley Krippner, a man heavily involved in Project Stargate with confirmed CIA associations, and someone who also conducted some of the experiments documented in these volumes. I've been investigating these volumes for almost a year. To answer an important question, the covert school experiments came from everywhere: Duke University, Princeton, and many other institutions, independent organizations, individual researchers, and yes, even some curious teachers and principals with quiet access to students sometimes dabbled and documented experiments of their own. And this still goes so much deeper. Most of the experiments detailed in Advances in Parapsychological Research derive from the Journal of Parapsychology, a peer-reviewed academic journal founded in 1937 by Joseph Banks Rhine at Duke University. What I found wasn't the gifted and talented program conspiracy people were talking about online. This wasn't something that started in the 80s or 70s like people speculated. This was something older, more pervasive, and documented. Before we move forward, there are a few caveats you need to know. The covert psychic experiments that I uncovered were conducted in public schools, not inside gifted and talented programs. But, and this is important, GATE programs seem to be the deeper rabbit hole. The two paths run side by side and eventually they start to cross. That's something Danny and I will be unraveling in time. When I first realized that covert psychic operations had been happening in US classrooms for decades, I was excited. Yes, what I found didn't match every detail former gifted students were talking about online, but it proved the core of what they've been speculating all along. Psychic experiments in schools were real, documented, and widespread. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I contacted the people who cared. Every creator who's ever made a video about gifted and talented programs on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, I messaged. I sent emails, DMs, I joined Discord servers, sometimes all three. Every single person you've seen cover this topic, I reached out to. And not a single person replied. Honestly, it threw me off. If you're deep into this rabbit hole, wouldn't you want the proof? I uploaded 2 videos on my channel, Cryptid Candy, breaking down what I had found. Through a mutual subscriber, I connected with Danny, Wicked Mysterious. We ended up talking for hours, and here's what I want you to know about her because this is rare. Danny genuinely cares about the truth. She's not chasing clout, she's not pandering to online hype. She wants answers, she wants clarity. She wants to understand what really happened to an entire generation of students. So I shared everything with her. Every document, every lead, every strange connection. And she'll be unpacking parts of that today. Because this rabbit hole is only getting deeper. And that's why I'm creating a larger series on my channel called Unlocking Gate, where I investigate the strange ties between what I've uncovered and gifted and talented programs. I'm also going to do further deep dives into advances in parapsychological research itself, alongside the Journal of Parapsychology. And just as a side note, if you're really into this rabbit hole, stay tuned for the special announcement at the end of this video. Wicked Mysterious makes a guest appearance in my very first episode of Unlocking Gate, and I'd love for you to check it out. But for now, let's return to the one person who understands just how deep this goes. Back to Wicked Mysterious.
The psi testing we're going to go over tonight was not specific to GATE per se, but it was the ideal environment that made this type of testing easier. That's because in GATE specifically, teachers had full autonomy, meaning that curriculum was teacher directed, and the teacher was free to write lessons as they saw fit. Some of these methods were considered to be flexible or non-traditional and did involve segregated and isolated classes. Whereas TAG or other similar programs was more structured and teachers had to follow specific learning models such as Renzulli's enrichment triad. So they're not all created equal. And the document I'm going to show you tonight is one of the strangest and most revealing files ever archived in the CIA's reading room. It's called Human Paranormal Capabilities, published research in China and Japan. It was translated and distributed internally by the CIA's Scientific and Technical Analysis Division in 1984. So this was at the height of Cold War research into what they called anomalous cognition. So again, Cryptid Candy was the one who first brought this file to my attention, and inside it, he found something almost no one has talked about publicly. Among the dozens of translated scientific studies, the CIA had preserved a series of experiments involving psychic children in China's public schools. The original source of these studies was a quarterly scientific journal published by the China Human Science Research Committee, and this was titled Human Paranormal Capabilities. So stay with me, I promise this is going somewhere. The CIA's translation of this correspond to Volume 2, Issue 2, which was dated June 15th, 1984. This wasn't just some random Psi newsletter. It was part of a state-sponsored research effort conducted through universities and laboratories all across China. They were all investigating what they called extraordinary human body functions. The table of contents of this journal, which the CIA reproduced in full, lists studies with titles like An Experiment on Using Psychic Powers to Break Needles and Then Make Them Whole Again, analysis of tests on transmission of sensations through channels in 25 psychic children, diagnosis by human X-ray vision, and a general discussion of parapsychology, Chapter 3, Advances in Parapsychological Research, ESP experiments in schools. So that last line, ESP experiments in schools, is where this becomes truly significant. So again, this is not speculation. It's printed, documented, and preserved by our very own CIA. So let's break down what this document actually says. The paper titled Analysis of Tests on Transmission of Sensations Through Channels in 25 Psychic Children describes classroom experiments in which elementary school students in China, specifically those identified as having special functions, were tested for their ability to perceive or transmit sensory information across a distance. Researchers would place objects or written symbols in sealed envelopes or on folded paper, or sometimes they would even tape them to parts of their bodies. For example, it could be under the arm, inside the mouth, between layers of clothing, and this was an attempt to eliminate visual cues. In some cases, objects were hidden in between the butt cheeks of the subject to ensure no possibility of cheating. They took this super seriously. The children were then asked to identify or describe the hidden items. Some reportedly succeeded, others failed, and in nearly every report, the emotional state of the child was documented as a key variable. The authors noted that calmness, relaxation, and focus seemed to improve accuracy, while anxiety caused results to drop sharply. Put a pin in that because it's going to become important later. So this sounds crazy, right? But whether or not these experiments prove the existence of psi phenomena, they were real experiments, not made up ones. They were peer reviewed and published in a journal funded by a national scientific committee, one that the CIA was watching closely. In fact, in a 1984 internal note, the CIA analysts wrote that numerous controlled studies are being conducted in Chinese schools to investigate potential human paranormal capabilities, particularly among children. The needle experiment mentioned in the same volume describes children allegedly able to focus on a metal sewing needle until it snapped, and then they were able to repair it using the same concentration. Another paper called Diagnosis by Human X-ray Vision reported children who could identify internal medical conditions in patients simply by touch or intuitive perception. The reason these Chinese publications caught the CIA's attention becomes obvious once you reach the section labeled Advances in Parapsychology Research, ESP Experiments in Schools. That title exactly mirrors an academic text from the United States called Advances in Parapsychological Research, Volume 2. This was edited by Stanley Krippner and published 7 years earlier in the United States. It appears that Chinese authors were building on Western research, directly citing it as part of their theoretical foundation. This shows that the international psi research community, from China to the US, was in open academic dialogue, and that the CIA was tracking how those ideas were being tested in classrooms worldwide. So, to sum up this first file, it was written and compiled by the China Human Science Research Committee. It was then translated and distributed by the CIA Scientific and Technical Analysis Division. And then it describes state funded experiments on psychic Chinese children, mainly conducted inside schools. So you're probably thinking that's all well and great, but what about in the United States? Well, those Chinese experiments explicitly reference advances in parapsychological research, ESP experiments in schools. So this shows that these classroom studies were related to information from American academic works on psi phenomena and on children. This document that I'll show here on screen is the first verifiable link between government intelligence files and real psi testing conducted in public school settings. It shows that psychic research on children isn't just conspiracy theory. This is published science, and it was serious enough for the CIA to analyze and further study. And that single reference to advances in parapsychological research is where Cryptid Candy went next. And this opens an entirely new can of worms, the potential evidence behind some of our shared memories. When you read what's inside it, you'll understand that this wasn't just a one-off experiment just happening in China. It was part of a coordinated scientific effort to understand and possibly develop psychic potential in children through the education system itself. So, this book, Advances in Parapsychological Research, is a series of academic works that was meant to document the research that had gone into psi phenomena. This was not necessarily meant for public consumption. It's an academic publication series printed by Plenum Press, which was a New York-based scientific publisher. They also handed physics and neuroscience journals throughout the 70s and 80s. Each volume of Advances in Parapsychological Research, which I'm going to call just Advances going forward, was written and edited by professional psychologists, most of whom held PhDs and published in peer-reviewed journals. It was the mainstream academic world's attempt to treat psi research, things like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and even psychokinesis, as a legitimate behavioral science. The series began in 1977, edited by Dr. Stanley Krippner. He was a psychologist best known for his work on dreams, altered states of consciousness, and human potential research. He was a longtime faculty member at Saybrook University in California, and he had previously worked at the Maimonides Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn. That was a real research facility that studied dream telepathy under controlled laboratory conditions, and that happened in the 60s through the 70s. This in itself is wildly fascinating and will likely be covered in a future episode, but for today, we're just going to leave that thread there. The point is that Krippner wasn't a quack or even a mystic. He was a credentialed researcher presenting his data to the scientific community. Krippner's goal with the Advances series was simple but ambitious. He was trying to compile every credible psi study conducted under controlled conditions. He wanted to summarize their statistical results and make that information accessible to psychologists, neuroscientists, researchers, educators, really whoever wanted it. The series ultimately included 8 volumes, each focusing on a different aspect of psi. Volume 1 covered general methodology and experimental results. Volume 2, published in 1978, focused specifically on extrasensory perception, what researchers call ESP. And this is the volume that we'll be focusing most on today. Krippner served as the overall editor and the author of the introduction, drawing connections between these studies and the psychology of consciousness itself. So, why would the CIA and later Chinese scientists be reading or referencing this material? Because Advances was considered the definitive reference on psi at the time. If you were studying ESP or psychic phenomena in any scientific or government-backed context during the 1970s or 80s, this series would have been of utmost importance. It was cited not only in academic journals, but also in government bibliographies and intelligence reports. For instance, declassified CIA documents from the Stargate and Sunstreak programs list Krippner's Advances volumes among their research references. And this reasoning for why they would use it is straightforward. If you were going to investigate psychic functioning, especially under laboratory or educational conditions, this was the most complete summary of what had already been done. So before we get to what's actually inside Advances, we need to talk about something else. The studies I'm about to describe didn't just come out of the blue. So by the time Krippner published Volume 2 in 1978, researchers had already been testing psychic perception in children for nearly half a century, and not so secretly either. Some of these experiments were hiding in plain sight, right in mainstream academic journals. So those Chinese classroom experiments from 1984 weren't the beginning or even close to it. They were just a continuation of research that had already been completed by the 1960s. That research said that children were the most promising subjects for ESP research. And if that doesn't sound eerily familiar to the gate conversation, it should. So let me show you how far back this goes. Modern parapsychology started in the 1930s at Duke University with Dr. J.B. Rhine. This is the guy who created the famous Zener cards, the cards that had the star, circle, wave, square, and the cross. But what nobody remembers is that Ryan didn't just test adults, he tested children, and he tested a lot of them. In fact, one of Ryan's most consistent findings was that kids were better at ESP experimentation than adults. They showed stronger results and more consistent scores. They often responded better to imaginative tasks rather than structured ones. Ryan noticed that children from ages 8 to 13 repeatedly outperformed adults. They did especially well in relaxed, playful sessions. When the test felt like a fun game instead of a lab test, success rates went up even more. It matches almost exactly what the CIA analysis highlighted as the child effect. Over the next 20 years, ESP research started moving out of laboratories and into natural settings. Schools, summer camps, youth programs, or even sleep labs that recruited minors. One early example was a line of classroom telepathy experiments designed for traditional elementary schools. Teachers would help administer very simple tasks. A child in one room would draw a picture, and another child, isolated elsewhere, attempted to draw what they perceived psychically. Groups of students were asked to send shapes, colors, or emotions. Some experiments had children view sealed drawings or symbols placed inside opaque envelopes. This should all sound eerily familiar. But again, these weren't secret government pilots. They were published as legitimate educational psychology studies. Psychologists were openly asking whether children's imaginations made them more receptive to anomalous cognition. Some of these early studies even introduced emotional tracking, like joy, laughter, boredom, anxiety, or tension, and how each emotion impacted accuracy. Almost universally, the results showed that children performed best when they were relaxed, not self conscious, but imaginative, or if they treated the test like play. That finding will come back again and again in multiple different studies on anomalous phenomena. I recently did an episode on the Philip experiment where Canadian researchers attempted to communicate with a totally imaginary being they called Philip. One of the main results of this experiment was just that. Childlike joy and imaginative play were key to the manifestation of Philip, who they claimed made observable and recordable activity once the researchers manifested him. During the 60s and early 70s, the same decades the US was refining the gate and tag models of gifted education, researchers like Dr. Montague Ullman and Stanley Krippner were running something far more unusual, and that was dream telepathy experiments. These took place at the Maimonides Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, where researchers tried to determine whether sensory information could be transferred during REM sleep. People rarely know about this, but the Maimonides lab didn't just test adults. They tested adolescents and gifted teenagers, the exact age group later targeted by federal enrichment programs. Some of these experiments included targets being sent to sleeping subjects, children being asked to keep dream journals and compare content across classrooms, and experiments tying imaginative capacity to psi responsiveness. Again, all of this was above board, academically published and referenced in textbooks. This was mainstream experimental psychology, not some sketchy MK Ultra sub project, but it was happening. By the time Advances Volume 2 came out in 1978, the scientific consensus, even among skeptics, was consistent. Children in the 8 to 13 age range responded most strongly in controlled ESP tests. Every major research noted it. Children's minds were just more open. The difference between the Chinese research and the research done in the United States was that China conducted the research through the state, and the CIA paid extremely close attention. So, why did the CIA care at all about what China was doing with psychic children? Well, if you've been following along with the Gate series, the answer should come as no surprise. They were doing it because they believed psi ability could be a national security asset. For decades, US intelligence had been running its own remote viewing and ESP programs, but the results were inconsistent, or so they say. So when China began publishing controlled experiments on children, claiming they were getting stronger and more reliable outcomes, the CIA paid attention. To them, this was a potential strategic advantage. China was treating psychic development like a long-term scientific investment. If China was successfully identifying and cultivating special function children, That meant they might someday produce intelligence assets that the US couldn't match. So, from the CIA's perspective, documenting these experiments wasn't optional, it was surveillance and threat assessment. And it was a way to compare China's methods to their own, especially as both nations explored whether human consciousness could be trained or weaponized or used in intelligence gathering, and if children were a resource for this. But here's the part that hits way too close to home for a lot of us. The exact same kinds of tests weren't just happening in Chinese schools or in specialized labs. They were happening in ordinary American elementary classrooms decades earlier, and they were documented well enough that they ended up summarized in the very same body of research. One of the earliest examples comes from a Florida elementary school teacher named E. Bood. Mid 20th century, somewhere in a perfectly normal public school in Florida, she read about ESP lab results and decided to try it with her own class of 22 students. The night before, she made a stack of cards numbered 1 through 10, and the next day, she stood in front of the room, sometimes at the back, and every few seconds silently sent a number while the kids quietly write down what they think she's focusing on. When she totals it up, there are 371 correct hits out of 2,800. Statistically, that's about 86% better than chance, and it ends up being reported as one of the strongest classroom ESP results on record. We don't get the school's name or the town, just a Florida elementary school. But we know it was a real public school with real kids whose parents probably thought they were just doing a creative math game. Not long after, in 1956, a school disciplinarian in Holland named J.G. Bushbach runs an even bigger set of trials. He oversaw ESP tests in more than 100 classrooms under his jurisdiction, again with ordinary elementary school children. The results are strong enough that he's invited to repeat the work at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He and researchers run the same style of tests with 23 5th and 6th grade classes and 17 7th and 8th grade classes. Once again, the younger kids outperform the older ones, and the pattern is so striking that it gets written into formal literature. And then this is where things get uncomfortable if you've ever had a crush on a teacher. Because when they break down the numbers, one of the most important variables isn't just a child's age or the setting, it's the emotional relationship between the student and the teacher. In other words, the more bonded and emotionally positive the student and teacher connection, the stronger the anomalous results. Other school-based experiments in that same era tell the same story. In 1955, a French elementary school teacher ran an ESP game with her classes during off-duty time because French law wouldn't allow her to do it as part of official lessons. Her results mirror the Florida teacher's findings. Later, an experimenter referred to as Miss Lawrence ran tests with preschoolers who were aged 4 to 6.5. With unfamiliar children, fewer than 1 in 10 classes scored above chance. With kids she knows and has rapport with, the scores beat the odds. The write-up on these studies explicitly conclude that the teacher's feelings about the children are influencing their ESP performances. Now, these studies don't come right out and say this child had a crush on their teacher, but anybody that's ever been in 5th grade knows what it's like when there's a teacher you're desperate to impress. And the more the children felt this, or the more emotionally invested they were, the more their attention went to them. And the data revealed that this emotional charge, whether it be admiration, attraction, or wanting to be special to the adult at the front of the room, shows up in the numbers repeatedly. Kids who feel seen and liked by their teacher do better on the Guess What's on My Mind tests. Kids who felt disliked or ignored do worse. And then there's the content of what's being sent. What I'm about to show you is one of the most disturbing and least discussed pieces of psi research ever published in an academic text. And it's printed right inside Advances in Parapsychological Research. In Chapter 5, under a section called Covert Target and Perception, X-Rated Parapsychology, there's a description of an experiment conducted by psychologist William Carpenter in 1971. And it's pretty uncomfortable. Carpenter's study used high school students as subjects. These students were given ESP cards and told to match them to hidden targets inside sealed envelopes. So this is pretty standard procedure for parapsychology at the time, except in this case, the envelopes didn't contain shapes or symbols. They contained erotic photographs. The text states that the images included, quote, couples engaging in sexual acts, end quote. And the teenagers participating in the study had no idea. They were never told that material was being used as part of the test. They thought that they were just doing ESP trials. The researchers then measured each student's trait anxiety to see whether emotional state affected performance, and of course it did. Even though this seems totally unethical, it wasn't framed in the text as harm. It was framed like it was simply data. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't an isolated incident. The very next paragraph in the text describes a similar experiment, this time with college students, so luckily they were likely not minors. But again, the targets were images. The fact that these students were published at all is pretty unsettling, but the fact that one of them involved high school students, minors, being exposed to hidden imagery without their knowledge or consent makes it even more weird and gross. So once again, this is not speculation or conspiracy. This is printed in black and white in a mainstream academic parapsychology volume edited by Stanley Krippner. And what this chapter tells us is that researchers were absolutely willing to use covert stimuli on minors in the name of psi research. They were studying children's unconscious emotional reactions, and they were doing it in ways that children could not consciously detect or even understand. This one section sort of changes the whole tone of this conversation, because if experiments like this were considered acceptable in academic settings, and if they were published, cited, and used as evidence for how psi works, then it brings up some other serious questions about what researchers were willing to do behind closed doors. And that is exactly why we follow these documents wherever they lead. So when people talk today about memories of being handed sealed envelopes as kids, or sensing that there was something wrong or too intimate about the exercise, they're not just pulling that out of thin air. Okay, so now moving on to another interesting update. Several former students from the Gifted and Talented Education program have independently reported a peculiar memory, and that's being given a small cup of thick, pink-colored liquid before certain tests or activities. There's a lot of speculation around this drink, particularly if it's to blame for the blank spots in memory. The consistency of these anecdotes, ranging from the late 80s all the way through the 2000s, has led to speculation that this was no ordinary school activity. In online forums, GATE alumni described lining up to swallow the mysterious pink concoction and then struggling to remember what transpired during the ensuing sessions. Many simply recall a haze of puzzle tests, strange listening exercises with headphones, or even ESP card games, all framed as enrichment, but little else besides the taste of that drink. So the lingering question still remains: what was in the pink drink and why was it given at all? Now, I'm gonna go over some theories that I've recently come upon, and I do want to stress that it's just theory. This is all educational and speculative. I'm not saying that this is true by any means, but it's still a really interesting thread. One intriguing theory points to sodium amytal, and this is the drug amobarbital, which was sold under the brand name Amytal. Is this possibly the ingredient in the GATE pink drink? Sodium amytal is a barbiturate sedative with properties that uncannily match the effects described. Notably, beginning in the 1930s and continuing through the 1980s, amytal was manufactured in a distinctly colored oral form. Blue capsules, and also pink tablets, marketed as diskettes. These pink tablets became a recognizable signature of the brand and were intentionally dyed pink for identification to help pharmacists prevent dosage errors. Although sodium amytal was also available in injectable form, it was a clear, colorless solution after being reconstituted from a white powder, but the oral tablet form was consistently pink. While no official documentation confirms a commercially produced pink liquid, a pink solution could have plausibly been created by crushing the pink tablets into a liquid base or mixing an undyed oral preparation with syrup or coloring agents for ease of consumption, especially in a pediatric or experimental setting. But most importantly, sodium amytal's pharmacology fits the anecdotal pattern. It's a fast-acting central nervous system depressant, and it can induce relaxation, euphoria, and mental confusion, much like a brief intoxication that progresses in minutes through effects similar to alcohol. So it goes from calmness and loss of inhibition to drowsiness and slurred speech. Barbiturates like amytal enhance GABA neurotransmission, which can slow brain activity. In many cases, people given moderate doses became uncharacteristically talkative or giggly before they eventually fall asleep, and then they wake up in a distorted, groggy haze. Interestingly, sodium amytal is known to cause anterograde amnesia, meaning memory loss from the period when the drug is active. Doctors observed that at a certain plane of amytal sedation, patients enter a cloudy, semi-hypnotic state and later cannot recall what they said or did. In other words, a dose of amytal could make someone pliant and chatty in the moment and then leave them with spotty memory of the experience. This aligns eerily well with what GATE students describe, a calming yet disorienting influence that lowered their resistance to unusual tasks, followed by difficulty remembering those tasks afterward. It's no wonder sodium amytal earned a reputation as a truth serum. In fact, its ability to relax inhibitions and blur memory made it a controversial tool in psychiatry and intelligence work. During and after World War II, psychiatrists used amibarbital in narcoanalysis sessions, essentially assisted therapy, to help patients speak freely about repressed traumas or to coax soldiers with PTSD into recalling forgotten battlefield events. Police and military doctors even experimented with barbiturates on suspects, hoping that sedating them would lead to them divulging secrets more readily. By the 1950s, sodium amytal, sodium pentothal, and seconal, all barbiturates, were the primary candidates for the so-called truth drugs, frequently nicknamed for their capsule colors, such as red devils, yellow jackets, pink ladies, etc. Under amytal's influence, a subject might indeed babble, but the truth it produced was unreliable. Psychiatrists reported that honest confessions, fantasy, and false memories could all intermingle during drug-induced interviews. A determined person might still resist or lie under sedation, and others became so suggestible that they fabricated stories to please the interrogator. But that didn't stop intelligence agencies from trying. The CIA's infamous MKUltra program, a series of secret mind control experiments in the 50s and 60s, used sodium amytal as one of many drugs tested on unwitting subjects alongside LSD, mescaline, and other hypnotics. Declassified documents and Senate hearings detail how CIA-funded researchers administered this to subjects, including student volunteers, to see if it could break down defenses and compel truth-telling. In one Yale study, 9 volunteers were injected with sodium amytal and then interrogated. While some sedated subjects did reveal embarrassing secrets or confessed to misdeeds, others managed to stick to their cover stories or even spun completely new lies despite the drug. One psychiatrist concluded that narco-interrogation is of doubtful value. Ultimately, MKUltra researchers learned that barbiturates could make subjects talkative and suggestible, but they could not guarantee truthfulness. Researchers into parapsychology came up with the same idea. They discovered that using barbiturates lowered ESP results in nearly all trials. What they did reliably induce, however, was compliance and memory gaps. Those dosed with amytal would have little recollection afterward of what they divulged. In fact, long before the GATE program existed, parapsychologists had been asking similar questions. Could a drug that lowers inhibitions and alters consciousness also enhance psychic abilities? By the 20th century, researchers exploring ESP were aware that certain altered states, like hypnosis, meditation, or dreaming, sometimes seemed to boost psychic test scores. In the 1940s and 50s, a few really brave experimenters turned to chemical agents. They tested simple stimulants and depressants to see if these might facilitate telepathy or clairvoyance. One of the earliest studies was conducted by Dr. R.J. Carteret in 1953. In a controlled experiment at Duke University, Carteret administered doses of amytal to some ESP test subjects, and he measured their performance on standard card guessing tests under each condition. The hypothesis was very straightforward. Perhaps sedating the conscious mind with amytal would free the subconscious, or perhaps a stimulant would enhance psi ability. According to Carteret's report called The Effect of Amytal and Dexedrine on ESP Performance, neither drug produced any dramatic psychic breakthrough. The subjects' ESP scores under the influence of amytal were statistically no better than their scores in normal conditions, and in some cases, performances even declined, possibly due to drowsiness. So it's fascinating to think about the anecdotal evidence and the actual studies that have been done together. On one hand, a generation of gifted students vaguely recall a pink sedative drink preceding unusual cognition tests in school. On the other hand, historical records show amobarbital was actually used in experiments in both espionage and ESP contexts. Ultimately, though, it was deemed ineffective for reliably extracting truth or enhancing psychic powers. If indeed some gate administrators were slipping a mild barbiturate to students, it may have been done under the flawed premise that a relaxed subject is an ideal test subject, whether it be for honest testimony or for psychic experiments. But the truth is, we haven't yet found any evidence that sodium amytal was given to students either in gate or part of ESP experiments. But for the former gate children left with only fragmented memories, the notion that this fogginess might have been drug-induced is both intriguing and terrifying. While there is no evidence that any students were drugged or given sodium amytal at all, you can get similar states in children without ever doing that. And you would do that through guided meditation with long droning tapes with sound programs that push kids toward alpha or theta brain states while an adult suggests images, feelings, or visualizations. So looking back at the typical structure of a gate classroom in the late 70s and 80s, a small hand-picked group of kids physically separated from the rest of the school, led by a teacher with broad freedom to write their own curriculum, encouraged to run creative and non-traditional activities, it starts to look uncomfortably similar to parapsychology research. The research tells us that the classroom is, quote, an extremely good place for ESP experiments. The younger, more imaginative children in relaxed or altered states did show the strongest effects. Now, I'm not saying that every gate classroom was secretly a psi lab, but if somebody wanted to do these tests, either the envelope test, guided imagery, emotional target games, or even watered down version of some of the more disturbing adult protocols, they could easily do it in a school day without anyone noticing. The gifted pull-out classroom, with its segregation and looser oversight, and its culture of, you kids are so special, we do things differently here, would have been the perfect place to do it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and special thanks to Cryptid Candy. Don't forget to check out his channel. So if you were a gate kid, or if you have a deep interest in this rabbit hole like we do, I want to introduce a project that Cryptid Candy and I have been working on. So here is the special announcement. Hi, I'm Danny. You might know me as Wicked Mysterious on YouTube.
And you might know me as Cryptid Candy on YouTube.
If you went to a public school, you might have been part of a covert operation that tested for psychic ability. And if you were in a gifted and talented program, you found the only place on the internet dedicated to providing answers to all of your questions.
We've already shown you the actual proof. Institutions and various researchers really did conduct secret psychic experiments in classrooms across the United States.
But we can confidently tell you that proving that this rabbit hole is real was only the surface layer.
We're examining documents that no one else on the internet has uncovered, and now you can join us on that research.
In our weekly podcast, we'll be guiding you through the documents that contain the actual proof of secret psychic experiments in schools.
We're going to examine every angle of these classroom experiments. We're going to find out exactly what researchers were doing, why they were doing it, what they found out, and we're also going to be tracking and connecting all the key players involved. And yes, we'll be investigating the interesting relationship between those experiments and gifted and talented programs.
We both get emails all the time asking us what else we know pertaining to these covert classroom ESP experiments. Well, now you can know everything that we know.
Creating a YouTube video takes a very long time for both of us because we both research, write, record, and edit our own videos. So to put it simply, what Danny and I know about school experiments goes a lot deeper than anything that we've posted on YouTube.
As a patron, you'll get weekly updates on every new document, lead, and discovery we uncover through our podcast.
Now you're not waiting 2 months for me to drop a video about school experiments. You can stay up to date with everything that we know, and trust me, we're finding new things out all the time. Things that sometimes don't make it onto YouTube.
And you'll also get access to our exclusive Discord dedicated to this research. As a higher tier patron, you'll get access to all the files we're investigating. We'll be directly dropping them into your inbox, and your questions will be prioritized, answered right inside our podcast.
At the highest tier, you can even join us on the show, share your experiences, or ask us your questions live.
Being a patron will help us fund all the research we're doing. If you want the full story, and if you want to follow this investigation as it unfolds, and if you want to help uncover what really happened inside America's classrooms, you're in the right place. I will see you again next week, and stay mysterious.